I'm pleased to welcome you to today's PACE seminar. Some of our colleagues have learned that really we don't start at 11:30, we start at 11:45, so people are walking in the door as we speak. But those in the know that they can get here at 11:45 and things will be okay. This is the last PACE seminar for 2014, but last week, or last time I saw you all, I announced a bonus seminar, which is today. And today I'm going to announce that on June 27th, PACE is organizing an all-day meeting, a conference on Common Core implementation in California. That'll be over at the General Services Auditorium from probably 10 to 4 on June 27th. So you all are the first to know, and I hope that you will come. There's a lot of action on Common Core implementation, as you know, and some initial research on what's going on and what we're learning. So please do put that on your calendars. Today I'm really happy to welcome Jorge Ruiz de Velasco and Dukakis from the Gardner Center at Stanford University. And I'm particularly happy to welcome them because I never see them at Stanford. They're like all the way across campus, and we never see one another there. So it's really a pleasure to be in the same space with them. But it's also great to introduce the topic that they're going to talk about today, which is their work on a College Readiness Indicator System. And this is work that has taken place partly in California, but with urban districts across the United States. And I will hand over to Jorge, who will begin the presentation.
Very good. So, first of all, I just want to thank all of you for spending what turned out to be, looks like a really beautiful sunny day out there in a basement in an old building, talking about college readiness. So what I'm going to talk about, what we want to do today is have a conversation after putting some things on the table. That is about a 3-year odyssey that the Gardner Center has spent with partners at Brown University and the University of Chicago, working in close partnership with 5 school districts across the country, our own San Jose Unified here in California, Dallas, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York City, trying to get a good handle on what might be a helpful set of college readiness indicators, as well as a framework and a set of toolkits that really supports district and community work at supporting what schools are already doing and responding to the pressures that states are increasingly turning to around college and career readiness as the standard. The framework that we are going to talk about sort of builds on and is intended to enhance existing early warning systems, much like the EAP program that PACE and that we worked on a lot in the past couple of years. It tries to build upon that in a couple of ways. We are looking at high school graduation and college eligibility to focus on readiness. And readiness meaning not just graduating from college and being eligible, graduating from high school and being eligible for college, but actually being ready in a way that helps you persist and succeed in college. And Cara will give our definition of college readiness for purposes of this work. It also moves a little bit beyond a focus on academic preparation to look at the knowledge, beliefs, mindsets, and sets of behaviors that young people need to succeed and have access to deeper learning opportunities both in high school and in college. And it moves beyond a focus on the young people themselves to ask, what are the indicators at every level of the system that young people move through? So what are the indicators that we ought to look for at the school level, at the district level, that really support young people as they move through these institutional environments? The focus on the district level is really important here because I probably don't need to tell any of you that what began with Goals 2000 and that really sort of ratcheted up in No Child Left Behind was a system where we had an accountability system that really had a very well-elaborated set of roles for the federal government and states to play in articulating standards, and then that bypassed districts and went right to create schools as the focus of accountability. That left districts without a clear set of roles and out of the equation in this work of meeting standards. So in California, you see schools and communities really struggling to keep up with and meet state and federal standards. And in California, that manifests itself now in our work that we're doing to set a new course for a state accountability system that by all accounts will still likely very much focus on school level accountability, and a new resource allocation system that actually begins the process of trying to articulate a role for counties and districts, but that still takes school level work as a level of accountability for new dollars. At the other end, researchers like ourselves and practitioners have done a lot of work focusing on what college and career readiness is and looks like at the classroom level and at the school level. And so over time that has manifested itself in our adoption of A to G standards so that we align better to what our colleges are expecting, greater attention to access to high quality STEM instruction at the school level, our experimentation with linked learning pathways, implementation of the Common Core where that really is happening in schools and in classrooms, and in a greater number of districts beginning to look at the social and emotional learning that needs to happen to get greater access to deeper learning. Where are the districts in this equation? What's the role of districts in supporting all of this work and in making it the part of the steady state of what happens in districts? So the College Readiness Indicator that Cara is going to walk us through, CRIS as we affectionately call it, recognizes the role, provides assessment tools, frameworks, self-assessment tools for districts to take on a critical role in creating strong supports for equitable access to college readiness. And it also conceptualizes a role for communities and context and partners, community partners, in mobilizing the network of supports that are needed for college readiness. At the end, I hope we're going to invite a little bit of conversation about deeper learning, mastering core content, critical thinking, collaboration, communicating effectively, all the elements of deeper learning that also happen in schools and classrooms, but also how our attention to college readiness indicators, frameworks, and the district role can create the opportunity for deeper learning opportunities in public schools and in urban environments. So although our presentation is not about deeper learning directly, it is about how do you make it happen in public schools and urban settings. And so I will invite some of that conversation at the foot. So I want to hand it over to Cara before I take up all her time.
Thank you, Jorge. And thank you to David Plank and to Pace for inviting us to be here today. It's really nice to be here, and after, as Jorge said, a 3-year journey on this project, it's really nice to be able to talk about it in its completed state. Jorge gave sort of a sketch of what is involved in the College Readiness Indicator Systems initiative that we were involved in over the past 3 years. And in sort of what we mean by a college readiness indicator system. I am going to elaborate on that. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of an introduction on the initiative itself and its background, introduce the CRIS framework, which includes a number of the component parts that Jorge started to talk about earlier as far as the different dimensions and the different levels. And then I'm going to talk about the lessons that we learned in our and from our work with the 4 to 5 districts that we worked with over the course of the 3 years in co-developing college readiness indicator systems with them, but in also studying these districts' implementation of those college readiness indicator systems. And then a little bit of a look ahead and the current climate here in California as far as college readiness is concerned, and how CRIS fits into that, and as Jorge said, Q&A after that. I am perfectly comfortable with folks interrupting me with clarifying questions as I go along. I think if we can keep the bigger picture questions for the end so that we can really get into discussion, that might make things move along a little more quickly. Okay, so as Jorge mentioned, there are 3 institutional partners in the CRIS Initiative. The CRIS Initiative was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. As I said, it took place over about 3.5 years. It was ourselves at the John Gardner Center, the consortium on Chicago School Research from the University of Chicago, and the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University. We each played slightly different roles in the project, but as I said before, the goal was to really co-develop with the involved districts and study the implementation of a college readiness indicator system. So just to start from a baseline that we can all be clear about, there are lots and lots of college readiness definitions. I'm sure you are aware of some of them at least. Many states have adopted their own definitions of college readiness. California has not yet, but I think is moving in that direction. We chose David Connolly, who's at the University of Oregon's definition of college readiness. Essentially, the level of preparation a student needs to enroll and succeed without remediation, and I would underscore without remediation, in credit-bearing general education courses at a post-secondary institution. The reason that remediation is such an important piece of this, or lack of remediation, is because of the very pervasive problem and barrier it presents to completion. And so we felt that it was important to advance a definition of college readiness that involved, that acknowledged the fact that remediation is a really significant issue, but to be truly ready, you need to be beyond remediation. Oh, let me say one more thing, which is that you've probably noticed by now that this is focused on college readiness and not college and career readiness. That is in no way a philosophical stance that we take at the Gardner Center. We're very much in support of career readiness. But for the scope of this particular project and the grant, we took on just college readiness.
Clarifying question?
Absolutely.
Can you just, do you mind clarifying, if you have a specific definition of success, is it just receiving credit or is it a grade?
You know, yes, I mean, I think you need to pass the course in order to, but no, we did not come up with like a specific cut score for a grade. And the course has to be credit bearing in order for you to, so does that answer your question? Yes. Okay, great. So what is a CRIS? It's not a person. There was some confusion in the beginning of this among the partners about who is CRIS. It's a what, not a who. And really it is a system of indicators, and again, underscore the term system, that does 3 primary things. Number 1, it measures particular dimensions of college readiness that include academic preparedness, but also include something called college knowledge, which I will talk about in more detail, and academic tenacity, which Jorge mentioned you know, as one of the non-cognitive factors, or otherwise known as social emotional learning. It allows for, similar to an early warning system that is focused on high school graduation, it allows for early identification of students in need of supports to finish high school college ready. And as Jorge said, it's not really just college ready and college eligible. It does sort of go beyond that to say we want to see success and completion ultimately. But it sets a student up for readiness that leads to success. And then it points to action at 3 levels, and again, this is where it's somewhat of a departure from existing indicator systems or early warning systems. So not only do we look at the individual student level in terms of indicators, we also look at the setting or school level, and sometimes even the classroom level, as well as the system level, which for these purposes we define as the district and in some ways beyond the district. But primarily the district for our purposes. So again, there were 3 sites, in addition to the 3 institutional partners who were working on developing the framework and doing the implementation research, 3 implementation sites across the country: San Jose Unified, Dallas Independent, Pittsburgh Public Schools, New Visions for Public Schools, which is not a district unlike the other ones. It is a school support network, which is an intermediary between the school district in New York, or Department of Ed, and a number of schools, several hundred schools in New York City, to provide supports and guidance using a lot of data, with a big focus on college readiness and a college readiness sort of goal for those schools. And then finally, School District of Philadelphia, they were to a much lesser extent involved for a variety of reasons, but they were involved to the point where they were kind of following along with what we were doing. So I would not say that our implementation lessons, which I'll get to later, apply to Philadelphia. But they were, part of the group that we worked with. Okay, so as I said before, there are really 4 primary components of a college readiness indicator system, as we constructed it and defined it. The 3 core and yet interrelated dimensions, a tri-level system, a menu of indicators, which I have not mentioned quite yet, but I will go into detail on all of these in just a moment. A menu of indicators which really integrates the 3 interrelated dimensions with the 3 levels in a matrix, and indicators within each of those dimensions and at each of those levels, from which districts and schools can pick indicators. And then finally, a cycle of inquiry tool that is really the mechanism that links the indicators or the flags that go up in the warning system or in the indicator system with the necessary supports and actions in order to respond to those flags that go up identifying students in need. So hopefully the next couple of slides will make a little bit more sense. So when we talk about an expanded view of college readiness, as I said before, most existing indicator systems and early warning systems really focus almost exclusively on academic preparedness. Some do look at issues of school discipline and attendance, which often fall in academic tenacity, but there is a heavy emphasis on academic preparedness. I think we are probably all on the same page about academic preparedness in terms of sort of the content based on coursework, the skills that students derive from being involved in the coursework and learning the content. And the achievements as a result of that, that they need to do college level work once they get to college. In addition, and this is entirely based on research and on research that we conducted into indicators that have a research base and have been tested as indicators of college readiness. This notion of college knowledge, which David Connolly was also has very much been a part of defining and researching, as yes, knowledge, but skills and behaviors needed not only to access college, but to really navigate college once students are there. And again, I will go into the details on this, but this really involves things like study skills, things like knowing what the college application process is like and what's required of it, SATs, definitely financial aid, FAFSA completion for kids who need financial aid, and those kinds of pieces that are absolutely integral to students being able to be ready for college and to actually get into college and matriculate. And then finally, academic tenacity. I mean, this is in the realm of what has recently been termed non-cognitive factors, or actually not so recently, but really paying attention to beliefs and attitudes and behaviors that students need to engage with, to take on the academic challenges and push through them and meet their college going goals. So again, things like self-discipline and different mindsets that are necessary, again, to engage with the academic work and even to engage with the process of applying and matriculating in college. So the next piece, as I mentioned, is 3 levels of college readiness. So I think we're all familiar with the individual or student level, and again, that's something that has pretty much been the exclusive focus of existing early warning systems. But also the setting or the school level and the system or the district level. We also would include the partnerships with community-based organizations, with other government entities, who are, also stakeholders in this process, but make up a sort of higher level of where things lie in the system, and really the way we see this is that the sort of resources and the policies at the system level have a direct influence and effect on those practices and conditions that are necessary at the setting or school level, which in turn have a direct influence or impact on the behaviors, the outcomes of individual students at the individual level. So they're very much interconnected, much as the dimensions of college readiness are. And then ultimately, really what we want from this system is to generate actionable knowledge at each of these levels that is going to improve student outcomes towards college readiness, that's going to improve school climates and teachers' knowledge about teaching students and getting them college ready. And then at the system level, what kind of investment, what kind of guidance needs to be there, again, for college readiness to come about. So if you put the 3 dimensions and the 3 levels together, it gives rise to a 3x3 matrix, which we call the sample menu of indicators. And we thought of the menu like a menu at a restaurant where you would kind of pick and choose from different categories. This is a sample of the indicators. I mentioned before, all of the indicators in the menu are research-based. We did an extensive review of the literature, and we actually have that very extensive review of the literature on our website if you're interested in looking at the source materials. But essentially, and I won't go through each and every one of these, but essentially there are, research-based indicators at each of the, in each of the dimensions and at each of the levels. I mentioned before, at the system level, the indicators have a lot to do with policies, alignment, resources, and resource allocation. And that those really have very much to do with what happens in the schools or the settings and the classrooms with the adults in those schools. And then that in turn has a direct effect on the students and their outcomes. I'm kind of going backwards here. I'm going to jump again to the individual level indicators. As you might imagine, for academic preparedness, grade point average or standardized test scores are common indicators of academic preparedness, common college readiness indicators for academic preparedness. You may not know that because of the work, or as a result of the work of the Chicago Consortium on School Research, GPA is actually a significantly more predictive indicator of college readiness and high school completion than test scores are. But then other things like participation in AP classes or international baccalaureate or honors classes. Again, at the individual level for college knowledge, I mentioned college knowledge of financial aid requirements for college, and submission of application to colleges that constitute a good match. You may or may not be familiar with somewhat of a burgeoning area of research on the importance of matching students' academic qualifications with those sort of academic expectations on a college campus, in addition to matching them with a school that has a high college completion rate, has a very, very strong influence on whether or not a student is actually successful in college. So the individual's submission of applications that are good matches. And then in academic tenacity, attendance and self-discipline are two of them. There's actually two more, behavior and mastery and orientation. Attendance is really a proxy for academic tenacity. If kids are showing up at school, that is an indicator that they are motivated, that they are willing to, stick with what they're doing. Self-discipline is a more direct indicator of academic tenacity. And then finally, at the setting level, some of the setting level indicators are sort of rolled up, aggregated versions of the individual level indicators. But I mean, we're looking at things at the school level. So consistent grading policy, again, the availability of advanced placement courses, for example, as opposed to the participation. And that can become an equity issue if AP classes are, offered at one high school and not others, and what are the reasons for that? High school, in the high schools, a college-going climate, and cultivating that. I mentioned college match. That's another example of an aggregated indicator at the individual indicator at the setting level, but it really has to do with the adults in the building knowing about college match and guiding the students to choose a college that constitutes a good match. And then academic tenacity, it's the perception of safety, for example, in the school based on student feedback. And another indicator is on the side of the adults in the building again, and the teachers in the school, their support for student autonomy. So it's a lot of it really comes from, again, the climate and culture in the school, and also from the practices of the teachers in the school. Okay, so we talked about the dimensions of college readiness, we talked about the levels, we put them all together in a menu of indicators. The next sort of piece in this framework is what we call a cycle of inquiry. And the cycle of inquiry is really the mechanism that ties the indicators, when a student is identified based on one of the indicators, to the necessary supports and actions that are needed. You can have an indicator system that flags students who are in need, but if you don't pair those students with the adequate supports and the right supports, then it doesn't really go very far, right? You're just flagging them and that's it. So this is really a process that can happen at the district level or at the school level where essentially it's a matter of collecting the data, deciding on your chosen indicators at each level and in each dimension, and then working each one through this cycle to look at the data, collect the data, decide what your thresholds are going to be, like what is the grade point average below which a student should not be falling if you want them to be college ready. Collecting that data, identifying students, making decisions about what indicators should be paired with what supports and what is available in the school, for example, or in the district in terms of the supports to respond to the needs of the students. Obviously implementing the supports, monitoring how that process is going, and then this is a pretty critical departure, I think, from some other indicator systems, making sure that once you're monitoring the supports, you're really determining whether or not these supports are responding to the need that the indicator flagged. And if they're not responding to them, then you need to adjust them. You need to apply a different support, you need to modify it, whatever it is. But so there's really an iterative process here so that it's not just an application of supports, it's a very deliberate and intentional process by which you're flagging the students, you're pairing them with supports, and then you're actually making sure that change is happening, and change in the direction you want it to be happening is happening. You'll also notice around the cycle of inquiry a number of different contexts, and this next slide will show what sort of blows that up. Basically, the point here is to just say that, we worked in these 4 to 5 districts. They were all so different in so many different ways, demographically, in terms of their structures. The statewide policy was different. But these are sort of the key buckets that we felt really influenced the college readiness sort of environment in each of the states. So the immediate community context, the different CBOs who are delivering the college readiness services and supports, also the parent community and the other advocacy communities in the area. Clearly the higher education context is enormously important and also, again, very different from state to state and in some cases sort of district to district because they are the receiving institutions in this process. Again, the state policy context, I talked about that a little bit in terms of the definition of college readiness and what the state is, what kind of a leadership role the state is taking, or what the kind of a leadership role the state is already taking on the college readiness issue. And then obviously the local policy context. So is the mayor's office involved in this? Are local supervisors or city council members involved with it? Are they partnering? How are they influencing or being brought into the fold? So if we then put all of this together, and believe me, this took a while to try to visualize, we come up with the visual of the CRIS framework, and really it includes all of the component parts that I talked about, the 3 dimensions, the 3 levels, the cycle of inquiry, which again, its primary function is to really connect the students with the supports that they need based on the flagged indicators. All of that is really influenced by the policy context. And then the outcome, which is hopefully college readiness and success and completion. There's a step at the very beginning called take stock and prioritize. That's really just a signal to the district or the school to take a step back and say, okay, what are our needs right now? What are our unique needs right now, either going into this school year or potentially more broadly? Many people do this on sort of a school year cycle. And to say, before we even get into selecting our indicators and selecting, our indicators at each of these levels and each of these dimensions, where do we want to kind of focus more broadly? What does our strategic plan tell us? How can we align these things and incorporate college readiness goals into what we currently are and our identity as a district and as a school? So I'm going to go back here. So This, in many ways, I mean, what I've presented up until now is really sort of the component parts of a college readiness indicator system, and then an attempt to put them all together into something that sort of works and can be implemented, like I said, mostly at the district level, but potentially at the school level as well. I mentioned before that our work with the district sites was sort of twofold. One of it was to, one of the roles was to sort of try to co-develop this with them. So while we did the research on this and the research on the indicators with them, and presented these pieces to them, and then in a whole, we were getting their feedback all the time. And we needed to keep the indicators research-based, but it was really important for us to sort of hear whether or not this was resonating with them, this was something that could be applied in other districts, and could be applied in their own district. So that was part of the work, and then the other part of the work was really on sort of studying through qualitative research, observations, etc., their process of implementation. We, before they actually kind of started implementing, we tried to help facilitate their process of selecting indicators and their work through of each indicator in the cycle of inquiry, so they sort of had a plan of how they were going to implement before they actually did it in real time.
Cara?
Yes.
So I'm clear, the cycle of inquiry is equally applicable at each of those three levels, right? That you could do a cycle of inquiry about a student, about a school, and
about
presumably
the district. Yes, exactly. And thank you for asking for that clarification. So really what we did was we brought the menu to the sites and encouraged them to pick at least one indicator in each of the domains at each of the levels. So, one indicator at the individual level in academic preparedness, one indicator at the individual level under academic tenacity, one for college knowledge, and the same for the setting in the system. And then yes, the hope was, and this wasn't as easy as we had hoped it would be, but was to take each indicator through the cycle of inquiry. So there was a very clear plan on how the data was going to be collected, how it was going to be analyzed, who was going to be doing that work, what was going to be the process for pairing the supports with the students that had been identified. I mean, again, the word system isn't an accident here, all very sort of systematic and intentional. Are there other sort of clarifying questions at this point? Okay. So next, I wanted to share with you sort of what the lessons learned were from the sort of research piece of the work that we did on this as the sites implemented their college readiness indicator systems. So there are 5 of them. I don't imagine they're totally surprising to you. I mean, I think any big sort of reform requires at least some of these, but these are pretty specific to an indicator system and, again, an intentional approach to college readiness. So the first is engaging leadership commitment to CRIS, and this was important. Not just in terms of having leadership, whether it was going to be the superintendent or an assistant superintendent, really champion the effort and champion it not only within the district and with the sort of constituents within the district who worked in the district, but also with parents and with community-based organizations and the broader community. And so that was one piece of it. Another was to really very clearly and consistently articulate sort of a vision for college readiness and consistent support over time for college readiness, but to do it in a way that aligned, I mentioned this before, that aligned with their current strategic plan, so that it was truly integrated and they weren't kind of on 2 parallel tracks running separately. you know, the other important piece of engaging leadership commitment is, again, to have sort of everybody on the same page using the same baseline in terms of what is our definition of college readiness and what do we mean by the goals, and just to continue to reiterate that so folks were moving in the same direction. And then finally, supporting a culture of data and data use for decision making, because an indicator system obviously is heavily data dependent. And, you know, I mean, I think the state, I think districts across the state are moving much more and rather quickly towards data-driven models of looking at student outcomes and student success. But you need the direction and the support from the top to say, and the mechanisms to say, we really are going to do this within our district, and I am going to support this in whatever way that I can through, you know, changing structures and systems. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And, you know, clearly the resource allocation has to come from the top as well, and that's another way of ensuring leadership commitment or demonstrating leadership commitment. So, whoops, sorry. An example of this was in the San Jose Unified School District. They did make a very deliberate decision to take their Destination 2020, I believe that's what it was called, Opportunity, Destination 2020 was in Dallas, Opportunity 21, to really bring together the CRIS indicators with their key performance measures that were part of their new strategic plan. And they brought together a CRIS team that met regularly and that really had broad representation from across the district. It wasn't just the research and accountability people, it was those folks, it was student supports folks, it was curriculum and instruction. I mean, it really was a broad base so that everybody was working on this and again, on the same page and contributing their thinking about it. So the second element is building data infrastructure. I mean, I mentioned that before. I mean, this involves a number of different things as well. The technical architecture, meaning kind of the database systems, the tracking mechanisms. I mean, you know, anything needed to sort of collect and analyze the data. In addition, the sort of what we call organizational routines. So, you know, how frequently or who was assigned to what. And what was the sequence of actually looking at the data, analyzing the data, applying the supports. A lot of this was connected to the cycle of inquiry, but people knowing their roles and responsibilities in this. And then formats and timelines that met stakeholders' needs. So, you know, in one case, the decision to implement like a data calendar where data was collected in certain areas, like on FAFSA completion, at the right times, because the district needed to be able to know exactly where their students were with completing their FAFSA applications before it was too late for the students to, this is a simple example, before it was too late for the students to apply and they didn't have any time. So really setting up sort of routines and time frames for when each sort of set of data was necessary to look at and to analyze and to keep track of the importance of timing. So an example of building a strong data infrastructure, New Visions for Public Schools uses a data platform called Datacation. And it is a platform that is very accessible to parents, students, you know, the educators in the building, to track student progress, and you know, it's a very transparent system. There's a lot of attention to getting the user perspective incorporated in it. So as they were building it, and I mean after they built it, they revised it to really meet the needs of the folks who were going to be using it. And it also involved a lot of, they had data coaches, so a lot of sort of site-specific technical assistance for folks within the public schools that New Visions worked with. Strengthening adult capacity around data. This is again for teachers, for principals, for district personnel, to really sort of try to do away with a climate of fear and anxiety about data, which I think is pervasive in many different fields, but to really show them and give them examples of how to use data, and to create a system where the district was delivering the right kinds of data to the right stakeholders within the schools, and data that was meaningful to them, that they could act on, and again, just part of that was shared understandings of college readiness from the beginning, and then things like the importance of college knowledge, and why they would want to look at data on college knowledge to help support their students in the application process, for example. Dallas Independent School District had a pretty structured process where they had executive directors of strategic feeder patterns of elementary, middle, and high schools, and they basically convened on a regular basis principals from each of those schools and had a very structured, almost scripted process of having each of the principals walk through their data and look at the kids who had been flagged and talk about what measures had been taken. So almost moving through a cycle of inquiry, but really at the local school level. Connecting indicators with supports, I talked a lot about this in the cycle of inquiry. I have to say this was one of the most challenging pieces, I think, of all of this for the districts and the schools. There was a lot of lack of sort of understanding or knowledge of what supports were in what schools and when, and certainly at the district level. And so this, is a process of really understanding, who the folks are who are delivering the supports, what it looks like in terms of taking kind of a landscape and how many supports they have in different sort of buckets or areas, and are those meeting the needs of the kids in the school. Having inquiry groups regularly convened to discuss these issues of what the supports are and are they being applied in the correct way. And yes, I mentioned the cycle of inquiry, systematic and iterative. So again, San Jose Unified developed these OPstat teams, and they had looked at the data, the district data, and felt that they really needed to have regular meetings to talk specifically about getting the students in need the right supports and to hone in on this. And so the OP is Opportunity 21, which was their strategic plan. Stat is statistics, and police departments and lots of different sectors have these kinds of teams, and they used these to establish cut scores or thresholds for at what point below students they didn't want students to fall in terms of college readiness, and they actually came up with 3 different levels of supports to apply for those students, depending on where they were in being flagged for a particular indicator, in this case, being successful in AP courses. And then finally, developing partnerships with community institutions in higher education. This is really the context piece. It's very much involving data and how the district leverages resources of the community partnerships, and they work, they link data together to look at how the services that kids are receiving may be affecting their outcomes. And it's also just using the intermediaries who sort of are responsible for communicating with both the on-the-ground partners and the district to raise awareness and coordinate services that are being provided, college readiness services. So I know I need to quickly move on. Pittsburgh Public Schools had a good example of this with the United Way. They had a mentoring program. They had very close partnerships between the school staff and the program staff, and they had a data use agreement that allowed them to share data and analyze data to look at the effects of the program on student outcomes. Okay, so really briefly, and I think we can get involved in some discussion about this. The challenges from the district perspectives, I mentioned this before a little bit. I mean, tracking and evaluating supports is it can be very nitty gritty and very specific. And just getting a handle on what supports are there and kind of what are the needs of the students and what are the best supports to apply to those takes a lot of planning and time. Similarly, the cycle of inquiry sort of across levels, again, doing that and having a plan for how you're going to actually connect the indicators with the supports and having a systematic way of doing it. And then the district and the school relationships. I mean, one thing we saw was just that there needed to be better communication between what the schools needed in terms of data and what the schools needed in terms of this system and what the districts kind of held as far as data, and making sure there were really open lines of communication so that the teachers could actually use the data that was provided by the district. And that the teachers could collect the data and feed it back up to the district level. And then, in terms of opportunities, I think several of these are obvious. I mean, I think CRIS is really an opportunity to sort of track progress on the Common Core standards, and particularly in the area of academic preparedness. Also that it can be a supplement because the Common Core is really quite focused on academics, and so the supplementary college knowledge and academic tenacity dimensions can be helpful for that. States across the country are developing new longitudinal data systems. I think this can be really helpful in terms of doing some of the analytics on the indicators predicting college readiness and college completion when looking at high school indicators. And then the 7 core districts are going to be working into their new accountability system measures of or indicators of school climate and culture, and also some of the social emotional learning pieces, which are included in CRIS. And then the local control accountability plans are also going to be looking at community engagement and at the similar to core at some of the school climate issues as well. And again, CRIS addresses those, so hopefully it can be used as a resource. So this is a list of our resources and their description. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can find them on our website. This is really what came out of the CRIS work in terms of written form, and we definitely encourage you to get in touch with us for questions on any one of the resources or really any one of the pieces that I've presented.
Do you have a bigger slide with the website? For those, there you go.
So thank you. It was probably more than a mouthful.
Angela?
Mm-hmm.
We have ADP, and we have a lot of easy
So yeah, I mean, they are aware of our work. We have had some conversations with them. We haven't, come together with them directly, but I mean, they certainly have our materials. So, we probably should keep that conversation going. I think that they were working also with somebody a scholar at UC Davis, who's working on college readiness, named Michal Kurlander, and I think she sees a more comprehensive take on college readiness as well.
I just don't want us to miss an opportunity before we write and we want to be a good idea we can be.
Yep. No, absolutely.
Yeah, Sarah?
Interested in your process between the indicators, that I appreciate that they're research-based and that was mostly your work, but I'm interested in the conversation with your district partners on that. Were there specific indicators that they were pushing back on, or was they wanted that don't sound research-based that weren't included?
Really good question. I didn't really go into that. So for one thing, we were very clear with the districts that we didn't want them to be doing more work than they absolutely had to do in terms of implementing the indicator system. So we really encouraged them, obviously if they wanted to choose indicators from the menu that they were already collecting anyway. So many of them were already collecting data on, and most of them had some kind of an early warning system or indicator system already in place, and that's where they were chosen as sites. So we first just said, this is not something to add more and more to your plate of data collection and analysis. So many of them did choose indicators for which they were already collecting data. So, sort of common ones for academic preparedness at the individual level were GPA and test scores. In Pittsburgh, they were really interested in looking, I'm just sharing this, they're really interested in looking at homework completion as an indicator of academic tenacity, which, I think intuitively makes sense, but it was tough because there wasn't a research base, and in order for them to have really tested whether or not it was an indicator, they really would have had to first of all, figure out a way to collect that data, which I think in and of itself would be sort of daunting in terms of what you pick and choose, but then also to link that to later progress, use historical data and link that to sort of seeing whether or not a student, based on that, had been successful in college. But they didn't have a system based on historical data to collect homework, collect that, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question?
I mean, I was wondering if there were more examples like that of things that districts are doing that actually don't have any foundation in research.
No, I mean that definitely was one. I'll tell you, there was a lot of interest in academic tenacity, a lot, and what we found was that, and we still feel this way, things are moving sort of quickly on academic tenacity in terms of their importance and their prominence, and they're getting into the public dialogue. The measurement side of it is not moving as quickly, and it really is quite challenging to measure, and there aren't, great tools out there. I mean, they're in the making. There aren't great tools out there to measure on academic tenacity indicators. Beyond that, I think another challenge is if you can collect the data, if you do have a good measurement tool, what do you do with it? So we know some basic things about how it really has to do with teacher practices and teacher interactions with the students, and whether or not students feel like they're in a supportive environment, but exactly how you sort of embody that in a teacher and in teacher practices is really, again, sort of evolving as we speak.
With respect to looking at the cycle of inquiry from a contextual point of view, was there any explicit reference to culture from a rural, urban, socioeconomic, racial, ethnic perspective with respect to the indicators or the domains that schools chose, districts chose? How does that lay on top of the current framework that you have?
That's a very good question. So there were certainly discussions of it. I mean, we see this as, and this isn't exactly what you're asking, but we certainly see this as a means of achieving greater equity, just because it's getting more students college ready and it's working with the kids who are having more trouble, because it's a kind of early warning system. We felt like we wanted to construct something, and the menu has a lot of choice because we wanted it to be sort of like malleable and usable across different districts, across different settings. So to the extent that we wanted to make sure that folks from rural and urban and different cultural backgrounds, I mean, that was sort of a big attempt, at least, to do that, so that there were choice in the indicators, and so that it wasn't something that was like a cookie cutter, one size fits all, and people could sort of tailor make it to their specific contexts.
Just two observations. One, in that context matters. So a lot of this work was embedded in work with a number of districts across the country. But if we think about the California context in our work around linked learning, the idea then that if you add from the academic indicators, which are about preparedness for entry-level work, success at the next level beyond high school, credit bearing, and then you add what in the CRIS framework is academic tenacity, but in the larger sense are the skills, mindsets, and behaviors that are so important to our thinking of linked learning, which is about, at some level, college and career readiness should be the same thing, because many of the skills, mindsets that employers say they need and want, and the academic preparedness at the level of just credit bearing at the next level of college are not very different. So in the California context, the framework it very much maps on to the way we've been thinking about linked learning and college and career readiness. The other one is, few of the states have as elaborate a community college system that we have in California that has operated as a second entry point. And so it strikes me as just a point of conversation that many of these same frameworks and cycles could apply to our thinking about community colleges and their developmental work of helping large numbers of young people reconnect to education, and thinking about this work as being providing a good framework for the work that community colleges do with more than a third of their students.
Yeah, Joel?
So it seems a big part of the work to develop this happened because you had districts that were engaged and willing to participate. You had an opportunity to work collaboratively with them. Now all of your resources are out in the open for anybody to take pass. I wonder if you have any observations about what the preconditions for success might be that would enable a district to engage in developing and implementing CRIS.
I mean, I think even though we came to them later in the process, I think the essential elements are some of those. I mean, it's sort of like, a willingness of the leadership to be actively engaged, to, establish kind of a culture of data, to align the, CRIS work that they're doing with their strategic plan, to sort of create an infrastructure for it in a sense at the district level. So to make sure that, the relationships between the central office and the schools are really fluid as far as this is concerned. In terms of building adult capacity, making sure that there is time set aside for groups of teachers and administrators to come together and talk through the data and talk about what students are experiencing, how students are experiencing, what kinds of support. So I actually think that the implementation lessons can also be looked at as the preconditions. And in fact, I mean, I didn't go into any detail, but one of the tools that we have is a rubric for districts that is based on the essential elements to implementation to sort of determine before getting started where they might lie as far as, you know, their own readiness to take on college readiness.
The other thing on preconditions is if you think about high schools and the way that the typical high school teacher is trained, this implies a different self-concept of what the adults in the building do, because it means that every person must be prepared to engage in a cycle of inquiry about college knowledge, about skills, mindsets, which a math teacher might say, well, that's not what I do. But it presupposes that this is the job that every teacher and adult in the building engages in, and that's, I would say, an important precondition. The readiness of staff to take this kind of work on.
I would also just say that it helps, and this was the premise that we started on, it helps to have some kind of indicator system established, or at least an understanding of what it is to sort of have an indicator system in place that, you know, requires a lot of systematic data collection, data analysis, you know, the whole kind of run through of the cycle of inquiry.
My question's kind of piggybacking.
Okay, sure.
So I was wondering if you remember what the San Jose system is that they're using. If of all the systems that you work with, you saw some that were working more effectively than others.
Yeah, so San Jose, I unfortunately was not the site lead for San Jose. My colleague was, and she can speak to this much better than I can. But San Jose did something really interesting that we were sort of dubious about in the beginning, and then a lot of the other sites, and we were pretty impressed by. They used the framework, but they actually chose that rather than go district-wide first, they were going to pilot it in an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school. Because they really saw, and I think there's growing recognition of this, that college readiness really needs to start, you know, in developmentally appropriate ways, but long before junior year in high school. So they actually came up with, again, using the indicators and using the you know, the dimensions and the cycle of inquiry, they came up with sort of a process at each of those levels for cultivating college knowledge, for, you know, flagging kids who were sort of you know, in need of assistance in a very routine and systematic way at each one of those levels, and making sure that it was entirely developmentally appropriate.
John?
On the cycle of inquiry, I think I saw in there also the role of the state somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Knowledge. And it's mostly an observation, but curious to get your feedback that it seems that in some ways the state may be the biggest question mark and have the biggest capacity to respond to the need for supports and intervention in terms of resources.
Mm-hmm.
In all three of your domains of preparation and tenacity. But also the furthest removed from the student and what's going on, and the hardest to move. So, you know, certainly critical to look at the school and the district as the key on the ground actors, but how do we get the, you know, this sort of cycle of inquiry really to influence state policy and allocation of resources or other you know, technical systems that's really
I think it's an excellent question. Did you have a response to that, or take it away?
It's a similar question, because I'm imagining, so I notice you're in states where there is no severe misalignment between what the state's new standards are context is a problem,
Uh-huh.
then what's next? But it's sort of a related question across it. How do you make sure, because I don't think there's anything inherent in the system now that makes sure that your feedback loops are looping the appropriate people in, that, you know, that the communication is crossing all levels appropriately, and that, you know, that the decision makers who have an influence at all levels that you're working to address. So I'm just adding on to his question. So, right, I mean, I think.
With regard to the support, so is that what you're talking about?
With regard to the support,
and
just making sure that as a cycle of inquiry is identifying that, you know, at the school level, this is the need.
Right.
How do you make sure that those folks who have, you know, who make decisions about resources are getting that information?
So yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, it's you're the two points you're making are connected, but not you know, not the same exactly. I mean, I think to your question, that was one of the last points I made, that the communication between central office, let's leave this data out for a second, but the communication between the central office and the schools is critically important because they're dependent on each other. I mean, the schools need the data that the district office has kind of crunched on their kids to know what kinds of, you know, issues they're having, what kinds of problems they're having. And then the district office needs the data from the schools to know how the application of the supports has gone and what, you know, changes need to be made, right? In order to know what, as you said, what kinds of supports to invest in or shift or whatnot, or what to allocate at which school, right? Depending on the needs of the schools. So there just needs to be, I mean, there is like a body of research on central office kind of school communications, and sort of similar to this, it needs to be very systematic. It needs to be really built into the routines of, you know, of the district and of the schools, and, you know, joint meetings between the people who are kind of taking on this initiative at the school level and responsible for the data, and, you know, designated teams at each school who can, or the principal, but who can speak to what's going on the ground and sort of advocate up for the changes that they need more at the system and the resource and the policy level.
well, and as a local control state, that's all over the place.
Mhm.
So what you're talking about, the consistency, well, there isn't consistency between that, the district and the school.
Right, I mean, that's, you know, I mean, it has to be structured, I mean, it has to be deliberate, right? So, you know, I think the question about the state's role, is, yeah, I mean, I think it's in the works.
All of
we
what
came
you
in.
said applies for the relationship with the district and state.
Right,
They
it's
should be
the same.
responsive to the information.
Yeah.
And respond to it and support the districts to give it. But the problem is, you know, this endeavor is sort of a district-based endeavor.
Right.
And if the state says, well, that's not our agenda, or, you know, the politics are such that it's just could be completely unsupported.
Yeah, so when I came in, Liz came up and said, what do we do if our governor says, well, data for what? Why do we need to do this? So, our strategy, you know, with watching the work roll out in other states, it has been people like us who've gone to the states and said, you've really got to develop this longitudinal data set, and this is really going to support your districts. And depending on how unitary they are and how much power people have to actually influence the whole state system, that has worked in some states. In a place like California, there needs to be a stronger constituency from the districts themselves. The superintendents and teachers and community people need to come and say, we need the state to step up here. And there has not been, so the governor is able to go around and say, well, parents don't ask for this, the teachers don't seem to be asking for this. So part of this work maybe is building a constituency as districts take on this work and show the value and the need for the state to really step up as a constituency for it. Might be a different strategy that will work for us until we have a governor who really gets it.
Okay, on that optimistic note, I want to thank Kara and Jorge for their presentation. Thank you all for coming. They'll be here to talk further with them. And see you all on June 27th. Thank you.